the last time that you realised you'd made a huge mistake about something? I was on the Underground in London last year, and I was in a bit of a rush. So as I came down the escalator and I could hear a train coming in, I decided to make a run for it. So I ran down the last few steps of the escalator and I rushed down the passage and I dived through the little tunnel onto the platform and I jumped onto the train just as the doors were closing. And it was only as the train pulled out that I realised that in my rush I'd actually gone onto the wrong platform. And instead of heading south on the Northern line, I was actually heading north on the Victoria line. Big mistake. In the long run, it didn't really matter though, did it? But we heard in our reading today about somebody who made an absolutely monumental mistake and was brought to realise it in that extraordinary event that we saw our film clip earlier. It's a well-known story, of course, to many of us, and there's so much that we could talk about today. But the thing that really struck me as I prepared for this morning was the loss of Paul's physical sight. I'm sorry, I will say Paul rather than Saul because we all know him as Paul, don't we? The loss of his physical sight. And for me, I felt that is a metaphor for the spiritual blindness that he had been experiencing up to that point. We've been talking about how God breaks in. And in Paul's case, God broke through that inability, that blindness, that refusal to see who Jesus is. And his life was never the same again, was it? You just have to contrast the beginning and end of our reading to see that. Verse 1, Saul was breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. And verse 22, Saul baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Christ. You couldn't get much more of a change of perspective than that, can you? It's a funny thing, perspective. This is an aerial photo of a rather strange bit of landscape. You can see there these peculiar sort of dimpled holes in the ground. But when that same bit of ground is photographed with the sun at a different angle, you can see that in fact they're not holes in the ground. They're little hills. They're actually sand dunes. And it takes the light shining on that area for us to see what it really is. And for our perspective to change, to see the same thing in a completely different light. And that's exactly what happened to Paul as the light of Jesus shone onto him. I mean, maybe some of us can relate to that sudden change in our understanding of spiritual matters. I remember many years ago I was doing a Bible study that included verses from across the Bible. And I suddenly realised that these verses had been written by different people, hundreds of years apart. And yet the message was consistent. And I just had this sudden realisation that couldn't happen. If these were just people writing stuff, you would not get that consistency. And I just had that sudden shift of perspective where I really understood this is the Word of God. Perhaps you can think of a similar change of perspective that you might want to think about this week. So there's a number of things that can cause spiritual blindness. I want to focus today on just one that I believe was a principal cause in Paul's situation. Something that afflicts all of us sometimes. And that thing is pride. Paul was completely certain that he was right. We saw that in that film, didn't we? His view of who Jesus was correct. The followers of the way were wrong. They were scum, according to that clip. They were blaspheming against true faith. He was so convinced that he approved of the stoning of Stephen, started actively persecuting other Christians. I mean, why did he set out for Damascus in particular, I wonder? It's 150 miles. That's how committed he was to stamping out this heresy as he saw it. And it took an encounter with Jesus himself to realise the utter, appalling mistake that he had made. I don't think that pride is something that we often talk about in church, and yet, as we see, it can lead to such catastrophic mistakes and consequences. So where did this pride come from that Paul felt? His conviction that he was right? Well, we get a clue when he talks about himself to the Philippians. He says this, he said he was circumcised on the 8th day, the people of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. You know, this was a proud man from a deeply religious family, intelligent. He'd studied in Jerusalem under great teachers. He was seen to be going places. He had reason to be proud and confident in his knowledge as he understood it. It's interesting to me that he describes himself as a Pharisee. They're a group whom Jesus often associated with spiritual pride and blindness. He said this. He actually said they are blind guides. And in Luke 18, he tells the story of the Pharisee standing in the temple, smugly telling God how holy he is, and looking down on the tax collector near him. But it's the tax collector who confessed his sin, who was commended by Jesus. So Paul came from this tradition of Pharisees, some of whom at least were convinced that their perspective on life was right, and who were deeply offended by Jesus. As I read about pride, I found many commentators who suggest that it's one of the worst, if not the worst, of sins. And there are frequent references to how much God dislikes it. So, for instance, we are told that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And Jesus saved his severest rebukes not for the tax collectors or the prostitutes or the people caught in adultery, but the blind spiritual leaders who he saw happy and secure in their pride. One of the most sobering verses I think I came across was from Psalm 138, which says that though the Lord is on high, he looks upon the lowly, but the proud he knows from afar. I don't know about you, but I don't want God to know me from afar. I don't want him to be distant. I don't want to be straining to hear his voice. But this verse warns us that if we're not careful, pride can drive a wedge between us. And I think that's one reason why God dislikes it so much, because it separates us. It makes sense, doesn't it? If I think that I have got it right, I know what God thinks, I know what God feels, I know what God says is right and wrong, I'm not going to bother to listen to him. As one author I read says, pride says, I've got this, and it causes you to look away from Jesus and shine a spotlight on yourself. C.S. Lewis wrote a lot about pride. This is one of his quotes from Mere Christianity. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. So pride is a dangerous, dangerous sin. It leads to other sins. It was pride that caused Paul to imprison and condone the murder of innocent people. And it's dangerous because it's difficult to detect. The Pharisees were oblivious to it. Paul was oblivious to it. And I found a quote in honour of the Scots in our congregation, because it was Burns Night this week. A quote from Robbie Burns, that's not it. That was another postcard I found, which I rather liked. A quote from Robbie Burns. I'm not going to make anything of the fact that it's a man saying it. Sorry, ladies. Ladies, this applies to us as well. But as Robbie Burns says, anglicised, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us? We don't, do we? Or very often we don't see ourselves as others see us. We see ourselves with rose-tinted spectacles. So, because it is difficult to detect, I think that we do need to look for it. And we've got some symptoms that we can look out for that can help us. Perhaps praying that sort of prayer might be one of them. Symptoms of pride, then, that we could have a look for. Well, first of all, comparing ourselves to others, envy or fault-finding, and we really see this, don't we, in the case of Paul, going along and absolutely saying, I'm right and these followers of Jesus are wrong. That can be a real symptom of pride. You know, the Pharisee who thought he was better than the tax collector. And it could be any aspect of our life, including the religious. You know, if we start thinking that our way of worship, our traditions, our knowledge, the length of time we've been a Christian makes us better than others, then perhaps we need to consider whether that is pride. You know, knowledge and traditions, of course, aren't a bad thing. It can give us structure and security and help us understand God more. But when tradition takes over from genuine worship and obedience, and when we think our way of worship, my way of reading the Bible is right, that's when we need to be careful. So comparing yourself to others. What about defensiveness? How do you react? How do I react when somebody says, what about that thing in your life? I'm not sure that one is God. Probably none of us like criticism, do we? It can be really uncomfortable and unpleasant. But if we find ourselves automatically rejecting the views of others, dismissing them out of hand without stopping and thinking, if we find we're avoiding that person who has a habit of saying uncomfortable things to ourselves, if we're choosing not to be accountable to others, it could be a sign of unacknowledged pride. And this is one reason why it's so important that we have friends who we are accountable to. It might be in a life group, it might be a prayer partner, it might be your partner in life, somebody who will be honest to you and who will help you see the pride in your life, in my life. What about self-obsession and neglect of others? Proud people can think that they're the most important. We can prioritise ourselves and neglect others. If you or I looked at our diaries for the last week, look at what we prioritised, what would we see? Was it interest in others? Was it time made for God? Or was it a focus on myself, on yourself? And the final symptom I want to suggest is superficiality. You know, if we're spending a lot of time focusing on the things that make us look good in front of other people, if we're thinking about, the things that are easy to fix, if we focus on our public life and neglect our private growth and time with God, that, again, could be a sign of pride that needs dealing with, that we're not facing up to. So, some symptoms of pride then that perhaps we all need to reflect on. So, what can we do about it? Well, I think there's quite a lot of things, and these are just some ideas, you might well have others. First of all, I think the obvious thing is pray. Pray for humility. It's really interesting, I think, in our reading, we're told when the Lord is talking to Ananias, he says, Go and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. And there's that sort of hint that because Paul is praying, God is ready to send Ananias to him. We don't know what he was praying. I can't imagine how Paul felt in that room, blind and thinking, what have I done? How long was I? But we know he was praying. And as we saw in that question from Peter, God gives grace to the humble. So we can pray for humility, perhaps a fairly obvious one. We can ask God to reveal areas of pride and spiritual blindness to us. And that's where we can get our friends to help as well, isn't it? If we can hope that, whole defensiveness bit. Others do see us differently to ourselves. Maybe you've got a good friend who you trust to talk that through with you and help you see things. And then once you've found those areas, well, we need to identify those and then we need to actively reject them. So when we find ourselves looking down on that person or reacting negatively to criticism, we need to take that and confess it and say, I'm sorry, Lord, help me to get over this, help me not to do that, help me to be more humble. Practicing reliance on God. If instead we're focusing on ourselves, we think we've got it right, we need to be looking at God and asking Him to take control in our lives in lots of different areas of our lives. Not relying on ourselves. It's another act of humility, isn't it? Give it time. This doesn't happen in a night. Rome wasn't built in a day. Paul spent 3 days, initially, mulling it over, and then we're told that he went off to Tarsus, and tradition tells us he was there a couple of years, learning and mulling over and beginning to understand this new faith. So it does take time. So don't get disheartened. It's hard, isn't it, when we keep doing the same thing over and over again. Keep at it. Give it time. The Lord can and will transform us. And the last thing I want to suggest is that we need to be giving grace and praying for others. Why is that? Well, if you're looking down on somebody, it's quite difficult. I find if you're praying for somebody, if you're actively showing them grace, if you're acting in love towards them, it's much harder to feel superior to them. A few weeks ago, Dave shared a verse which had been very much on his mind, and it's really been on mine too since, and I've been very personally challenged with it. You might even remember, it was this verse, the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. Paul experienced the grace and compassion of God on the way to Damascus. And I really feel very convinced that it's something we too must show to others. And that's why we must be praying and showing grace and compassion and love into the lives of people who we otherwise look down on. It's just so important. And so, we might think that the opposite of pride is humility, but the opposite of pride is also love. It's the love of Christ for Paul that overwhelmed him, that broke in and helped to destroy that pride way of life that he'd had. I mentioned earlier about how I began to understand the consistency of the Bible message. And it's interesting too, I've really found this with this sermon series as well, because when I was reading about Paul, his change of heart, and then we're told that he was baptised and started preaching, I was reminded of Peter's talk the other week about Jesus' baptism. He spoke about the fire of the Spirit winnowing out the wrong in our lives. And then he talked about our identity in God's family. In this passage, we see the pride being burned out of Paul's life, the coming of the Holy Spirit. And did you notice? Ananias greets him as Brother Saul. That new identity, that new family that Paul came into. Just thought that's an interesting link between the two sermons. So, we can take heart and we can be reassured. Pride can separate us to an extent from God. Of course, we're never totally separated from him. But humility leads to hearing God. Pride can be subtle and dangerous, but we can detect it. God can shine a light on it. He can help us to deal with it, and we will experience his grace as Paul did. I want to finish with a challenge to us, to actively seek out and confront the pride in our lives. I'm going to bring up a verse from Psalm 139 and invite you to say it with me, if you wish. It comes with a word of warning. God takes this sort of thing very seriously. I prayed this verse once as a young Christian, and I had a very uncomfortable few months. As God said, okay, then Judith, you're on. I'm going to point out some things I'd like you to change, and he did, and it was uncomfortable. But he took me seriously, and hopefully I grew through the experience and became a little bit more like him. So, this is the verse. If you want to pray it, I'm not going to ask you to pray it out loud, you can just say it quietly in your hearts. But if you do pray it, be prepared for some discomfort. Be prepared for God to take you seriously. But also, be ready to meet the grace and the mercy of Jesus as he shines a light on our lives. So I'm going to read it out loud, and please join me as you wish, or not as you wish. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the light